The tourist smirked, tightening the belt around the post near the stoic queen's guard, confident his money and status made him untouchable. "It's just a joke," he laughed, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. But when the guard finally broke his silence, his words cut through the air like thunder, freezing the crowd. What happened next didn't just shatter the tourist's arrogance. It left everyone questioning their own sense of respect and tradition. Let's start from the beginning. London was its usual self, bustling streets filled with commuters, iconic red buses weaving through narrow roads, and throngs of tourists swarming the city's landmarks. Near the Queen's Guard Memorial, Sergeant Edward Hamish stood stoic and unwavering. Clad in his immaculate red uniform and towering bearskin hat, he was the living embodiment of discipline and tradition, a silent reminder of a heritage that refused to waver in the face of modern chaos. The day, like countless others, had begun predictably. Visitors snapped photos, posed awkwardly, and whispered excitedly about the guard's reputed stillness. But amidst the crowd, a raucous group of young tourists broke through the usual hum of admiration. One of them, a tall man wearing a garish yellow t-shirt emblazoned with the words, "I'm the king of the world," strutted forward. His loud voice easily overpowered the ambient noise. "Hey dude, are you even alive? Or are you just one of those wax figures?" he jeered, earning a chorus of laughter from his friends. Edward remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this. His duty was clear: maintain composure, no matter the provocation. Yet, the man wasn't content to stop there. Emboldened by the laughter around him, he stepped closer, his hand outstretched toward Edward's bearskin hat. "Come on, mate, crack a smile. You're on the clock, aren't you?" he added with a smirk, dripping with condescension. Narrators aside. The classic tourist dilemma. You spend a few pounds on travel, and suddenly you think the world is your stage. And here stands Edward, a symbol of dignity, facing a man who thinks respect is optional when on holiday. The crowd began to take notice. Some chuckled nervously, others exchanged uneasy glances. A few passers-by muttered under their breath, but no one intervened. Edward, for his part, held firm. Though his teeth clenched beneath his resolute expression, he refused to let his irritation show. And then came the turning point. One of the man's friends, shorter but no less obnoxious, called out with an idea that was both absurd and infuriating. "Let's tie him to the post. That'll make a killer shot for Instagram." The suggestion was met with uproarious laughter from their group. They quickly produced a thin belt, clearly intent on making their brilliant plan a reality. Cameras clicked, and a few in the crowd even pulled out their phones to record the scene. Narrator's commentary: "Really? This is where we are now? People tying a soldier, who represents centuries of tradition and sacrifice, to a post for a social media post? If you're rolling your eyes right now, trust me, you're not alone." Edward felt a surge of anger beneath his perfectly pressed uniform. His instincts screamed to act, to put an end to this farce, but his training reminded him of his role. He was not just a soldier, he was a symbol. For a moment, he closed his eyes briefly, letting the roar of the crowd blur into the background as he steeled himself to endure. The tourists, oblivious to the growing discomfort around them, continued their antics. One of them looped the belt around the post near Edward, gesturing dramatically as though staging a theatrical scene. "This is how they do it in London, right?" he shouted, grinning at his friends. The crowd began to murmur louder. A few voices of protest pierced through the noise. "Show some respect. This isn't a joke." But the group was too wrapped up in their performance to care. They laughed, posed for pictures, and shouted over the dissenting voices. Narrator's insight. You can almost feel the tension, can't you? The kind that makes you wonder how far people will go when they think there are no consequences. And Edward? He stands there, carrying the weight of tradition, silently questioning how we got to this point. Edward's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his mind racing. How have we become this? A world where honor and history are mere props for amusement? And how much longer can I stand by as they degrade what I swore to protect? The air was thick with a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Cameras continued to flash, and the tourists showed no signs of stopping. But little did they know, their fun was only the beginning of a much bigger lesson. A lesson that neither they nor the crowd would soon forget. The laughter of the group grew louder, their antics gaining confidence as the surrounding crowd either observed in awkward silence or filmed with their phones. Two men from the group grabbed a thin belt, their movements exaggerated for the camera, and began circling the post near Edward, gesturing as though preparing to tie him up. The scene was part slapstick, part spectacle, and entirely inappropriate. Narrators aside, you can almost feel the secondhand embarrassment, can't you? Watching someone push their luck so far, they tumble right over the edge. These tourists? They're doing a swan dive into the deep end of disrespect. Amid this circus of poor judgment, the atmosphere shifted when an older woman stepped forward. Small in stature, but commanding in presence, she leaned heavily on a sturdy wooden cane. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief and fury as she made her way to the front of the scene. "Shame on you," she exclaimed, her voice clear and sharp. The cane tapped against the cobblestones for emphasis. "This man is serving his country, and you're acting like children." The crowd fell momentarily silent, some lowering their phones in guilt. But the leader of the group, the tall man in the yellow t-shirt, shrugged and replied with a smirk, "Relax, Grandma. It's all just a bit of fun." Narrator's commentary. "Oh, of course. The universal defense of bad behavior. It's just a joke." As if those words magically erased the insult. You can almost hear the collective groan from the onlookers. Edward, who had remained steadfastly silent until now, finally broke his stillness. His deep, measured voice cut through the air like a blade. "You have crossed the line. Cease this behavior immediately." The shift was palpable. The tone of Edward's voice, calm but unmistakably firm, sent a ripple through the crowd. Even the tourists hesitated, the authority in his words shaking their confidence. Then, in a practiced motion, Edward removed his rifle from its position on his shoulder, holding it at the ready. It wasn't a threat, just a clear reminder of his role and the seriousness of his station. The crowd collectively held its breath. Nearby, a fellow officer noticed the disturbance and began making his way through the throng to assess the situation. Suddenly, the bravado of the group leader faltered. He raised his hands slightly, his grin faltering. Hey, we were just kidding," he stammered. "No harm meant, really." But as the officer approached, the situation spiraled further. One of the younger tourists, perhaps trying to salvage the fun, reached out toward Edward's arm, as if to shake him or get his attention. The movement was impulsive, but it crossed yet another boundary. Edward didn't flinch, but the officer was quicker, intercepting the motion with a firm grip. The scene erupted. The officer called for backup, while the crowd, now fully engaged, turned on the tourists. Angry murmurs swelled into shouts. "Disgraceful! Show some respect! This is not a theme park." Phones were now capturing every angle of the unfolding drama, but this time the tourists weren't in control of the narrative. Their playful arrogance had backfired spectacularly, and the expressions on their faces ranged from confusion to embarrassment as the officer began taking names. Narrator's insight. Isn't it satisfying when the tide finally turns? That moment when someone who's been acting out suddenly realizes they've gone too far, and now the crowd they once sought to entertain has become their jury. Edward remained composed, though the intensity of the situation was undeniable. He didn't need to say another word. His actions and unwavering demeanor had already spoken volumes. The tourists, now visibly uneasy, tried to deflect blame, offering half-hearted excuses. "We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke." But the officer wasn't swayed. Neither was the crowd, whose chants of disapproval only grew louder. The leader of the group turned pale, realizing the spectacle they had orchestrated was no longer amusing. It was humiliating. As the tourists were escorted away by the officers, the crowd erupted into a mixture of applause and relieved murmurs. Someone shouted, "Thank you," while another called out, "You're a hero, mate." Edward, still standing tall and resolute, gave no reaction beyond a slight adjustment of his hat. Narrator's conclusion, and just like that, the balance was restored. Edward didn't need to shout or fight. His quiet strength was enough to remind everyone why he stood there in the first place. Sometimes, dignity is the most powerful weapon of all. The crowd began to disperse, but the story was far from over. Videos of the incident would soon flood social media, turning the quiet guardian of tradition into an unwitting symbol of respect and resilience. But for now, Edward resumed his post, his gaze steady, as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in his day. By the following morning, the scene at the Queen's Guard post was no longer just a passing spectacle, it was a global conversation. A passerby's video capturing every detail of the tourists' antics and the dignified response of Sergeant Edward Hamish had gone viral overnight. Social media platforms buzzed with commentary. Headlines across major outlets declared, "Queen's Guard maintains poise amidst disrespectful tourists." Underneath the shared video, the comments section became a tapestry of outrage, admiration, and reflection. One particularly poignant comment stood out, its words resonating deeply with many. "When we lose respect for tradition, we lose respect for ourselves." Narrator's insight. And isn't that the crux of it all? A simple truth that so many seem to have forgotten, now brought into sharp focus by a silent man in a red coat. The tourists, who had basked in their fleeting moment of fame the day before, were now at the center of an entirely different spotlight. Facing public backlash, they were fined for their behavior and issued a formal apology to the Queen's Guard. The group's leader, now visibly humbled, appeared in a short video statement. "It was a dumb thing to do. I've realized how wrong we were, and I'm sorry for disrespecting the traditions and the guards." Narrator's commentary, the power of collective accountability. Nothing like the glare of public opinion to turn arrogance into regret. Meanwhile, Edward's name was whispered with reverence across barracks and beyond. Returning to his post later that day, he was greeted by a fellow guardsman with an uncharacteristic grin. "You're a legend now, Ed," the colleague said, his tone laced with admiration. Edward, ever composed, adjusted the brim of his bearskin hat and replied with quiet humility, "I was just doing my job." Narrator's reflection. Of course he says that. Humility is woven into the fabric of people like Edward. But we know the truth. It's far more than just a job. It's a symbol, a responsibility, and in moments like these, a mirror reflecting what society values, or fails to. Later that afternoon, as Edward took his position once more, the crowd began to gather, though this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Instead of casual gawking, there was an air of respect. A ripple of applause spread as Edward assumed his stance, a gesture of collective gratitude that spoke louder than words. Someone in the crowd called out, "Thank you for your service." Another added, "You showed the world what honor looks like." Edward gave a slight nod, his face as stoic as ever, but deep inside he felt a flicker of pride, not for himself, but for what his actions had come to represent. His quiet endurance had sparked a moment of reflection for thousands, perhaps millions. Narrator's conclusion. And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Honor doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands firm, unwavering, until the world finally takes notice. As the crowd continued to swell, cameras flashed, and voices murmured in awe, Edward stood like the sentinel of tradition he had always been. Only now, he wasn't just guarding history, he was actively shaping it.